Daniel Mercer had always believed that the hardest words a person could say were, "I need help." He was wrong. The hardest words were the ones spoken by someone who had already given up asking. She stood at the edge of the community library courtyard, clutching a faded canvas bag with both hands as though it contained everything she had left in the world. She looked around, not with fear, but with the quiet uncertainty of someone who no longer expected anyone to notice she existed. When Daniel walked past, she lowered her eyes and whispered so softly that he almost missed it. "I have nowhere left to go." He stopped. The afternoon sun warmed the brick path beneath their feet. Families wandered toward the nearby park. A volunteer group packed away tables after a neighborhood book exchange. Life moved around them without slowing, but for Daniel, time seemed to pause. He looked at the woman again. She appeared to be in her early 30s, dressed neatly despite clothes that had clearly been worn many times. Her brown hair was tied back in a simple ponytail, and although exhaustion rested behind her blue eyes, there was dignity in the way she stood. Daniel could have nodded politely and continued walking. Instead, he smiled gently. "Then stay with me." The woman blinked. "What?" "I have a spare room," Daniel said carefully. "It's nothing fancy, but it's warm, it's clean, and nobody should have to wonder where they're sleeping tonight." Her eyes widened. "You don't even know me." "No," Daniel admitted. "I don't. So why would you trust me?" Daniel thought for a moment before answering. "Because someone once trusted me when I had nothing." The woman looked away, pressing her lips together as if trying to hold back emotions she wasn't ready to release. "My name's Emily," she finally said. "I'm Daniel." For a few seconds neither of them spoke. Then Emily asked quietly, "Are you sure?" Daniel nodded. "I'm sure." Daniel lived in a modest cottage on the edge of Ashbrook, a peaceful English town where nearly everyone recognized one another by sight. The cottage wasn't large. It had 2 bedrooms, a tiny kitchen filled with second-hand furniture, and a garden that somehow produced more tomatoes than one person could ever eat. As they drove there in Daniel's aging blue hatchback, silence filled the car, not uncomfortable silence, but careful silence. Daniel didn't ask questions. Emily didn't offer explanations. Sometimes kindness didn't begin with curiosity. Sometimes it began with patience. When they arrived, Daniel carried her canvas bag while Emily hesitated at the doorway. "It's been a long time since someone invited me inside a home," she admitted. "Then let's change that." She stepped through the door slowly. The cottage smelled of fresh bread and lavender. Family photographs lined the hallway, though Daniel noticed Emily studying them with unusual attention. "You have children?" she asked. "I have nieces and nephews." "You look happy in these pictures." "I was." "Were?" Daniel smiled sadly. "I still am. Just differently." Emily nodded, understanding more than his words revealed. Daniel showed her the spare bedroom. The room contained a single bed with a patchwork quilt, a wooden wardrobe, a bookshelf half filled with novels, and a small window overlooking the vegetable garden. "It's beautiful," Emily whispered. Daniel laughed. "I've never heard anyone call this room beautiful." "That's because they weren't looking for peace." He quietly closed the door to give her privacy. That evening Daniel cooked vegetable soup with homemade bread. When he placed the bowl in front of Emily, she stared at it for several seconds before lifting the spoon. "It's okay if you don't like soup," Daniel joked. Emily smiled faintly. "I was just remembering." "What?" "The last time someone made dinner without expecting anything in return." Daniel didn't know how to answer. So he simply sat down and ate beside her. The conversation drifted naturally. Emily learned Daniel repaired antique furniture for a living. Daniel learned Emily had once worked as a children's librarian. "You must have loved books." "I still do." "What happened?" Emily looked toward the kitchen window. Life happened. Daniel noticed the way she gently redirected the conversation. He respected it. No more questions. Over the following days, the cottage settled into an easy rhythm. Daniel left for work each morning. Emily insisted on helping around the house despite his repeated assurances that she didn't need to. One afternoon he returned to find every bookshelf dusted, every window sparkling, and fresh flowers arranged in old jam jars across the dining table. "You've transformed the place." Emily looked embarrassed. "I hope you don't mind." "Mind?" Daniel laughed. "I think my house is offended it never looked this nice before." For the first time, Emily laughed properly. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it sounded like someone remembering how happiness felt. Ashbrook was the sort of town where neighbors noticed everything. Mrs. Foster from across the lane brought over blackberry pie. "I thought you might enjoy this." Her eyes shifted toward Emily. "And you must be Daniel's cousin." Emily looked confused. Daniel smiled. "Friend." Mrs. Foster nodded warmly without asking another question. "Well then, welcome." After she left, Emily looked surprised. She didn't ask anything. People here usually wait until they're invited. I'd forgotten people could do that. Daniel cut 2 slices of pie. "My grandmother used to say that kindness isn't asking for someone's story. It's giving them enough safety to tell it when they're ready." Emily quietly repeated the sentence to herself. Enough safety. She seemed to hold on to those words. Every Thursday evening Daniel volunteered at the community workshop where people repaired old furniture instead of throwing it away. Emily offered to come. "I don't know anything about woodworking." "You don't have to." She spent the evening making tea for volunteers, organizing donated books, and chatting with elderly visitors who simply enjoyed having someone listen. By closing time everyone knew her name. On the drive home Daniel smiled. "You were popular." Emily looked out the window. "I'd forgotten I could still be useful." Daniel slowed the car before answering. "You were never useless. You don't know that." "I know enough." A week later Daniel returned from work earlier than expected. He found Emily sitting alone in the garden. She was holding a folded envelope. Her eyes were red. Daniel sat beside her without speaking. Several minutes passed. Finally she handed him the unopened letter. "It came this morning." He looked at the handwriting. "You don't have to show me." "I want to." He carefully unfolded the letter. It was from the landlord of Emily's former flat. Most of it concerned unpaid rent, forwarding addresses, and formal notices. At the bottom was one handwritten sentence. "I hope you find somewhere to begin again." Daniel folded the letter. "That was kind." Emily nodded. He tried to help. "But I wouldn't let anyone." Daniel waited. She took a deep breath. "I kept believing I had to solve everything by myself. That's a heavy burden. I thought accepting help meant failing." Daniel looked toward the rows of tomatoes growing behind the fence. "When I planted those, every single plant needed a stake to lean on." Emily looked puzzled. "So? They still grew into healthy plants." She smiled. "They weren't weak. They were supported." Emily looked down at the letter. "I wish I'd understood that sooner." That weekend Ashbrook hosted its annual village fair. Music floated through the square while children painted wooden birdhouses and local bakers competed for the best apple pie. Daniel convinced Emily to come. At first she stayed close behind him, uncomfortable among crowds. But little by little she relaxed. An elderly gentleman running the second-hand book stall noticed Emily browsing. "You know your authors. I used to catalog books. Would you mind helping me organize these?" She spent nearly 2 hours arranging shelves alphabetically while recommending stories to families. Watching from across the square, Daniel noticed something remarkable. Emily no longer looked like someone searching for somewhere to belong. She looked like someone who already did. When the fair ended, the elderly bookseller hurried over. "My name's Arthur," he said warmly. "Would you consider helping at the shop a few mornings each week? I can't pay much, but I could certainly use someone who loves books." Emily stared at him. "You mean, work?" "If you'd like." She looked toward Daniel. He simply smiled. The decision was hers. For the first time in a very long while, Emily's future no longer felt like an empty road. It felt like the first page of a new chapter waiting to be written. The next Monday morning, Emily stood in front of the hallway mirror wearing a pale blue cardigan that Daniel had found tucked away in the spare wardrobe. It had belonged to his late sister, and when he offered it, he had done so gently, without pressure. "If it helps you feel comfortable, you're welcome to borrow it." Emily had hesitated before accepting. Now she smoothed the sleeves nervously. "Do I look like someone who belongs in a bookshop?" she asked. Daniel pretended to study her seriously. "You look like someone who could recommend the perfect story to a stranger." A small smile appeared. "That wasn't exactly my question." "It's a better answer." She laughed softly, and for a moment Daniel saw something new in her expression, not relief, not gratitude, but confidence beginning to return. Arthur's second-hand bookshop sat beside the bakery on Willow Street. The sign above the door read "Turn the Page," and the windows were crowded with novels, poetry collections, and children's books arranged in cheerful towers. When Emily stepped inside, the familiar scent of paper and polished wood seemed to settle around her like a welcome. Arthur emerged from behind a stack of encyclopedias. "Ah, there you are. I was beginning to worry a better bookshop had stolen you." Emily smiled. "I nearly turned around twice on the walk here." "Excellent," Arthur said. "That means you care." He handed her a set of keys. "Would you like to open the front shelves each morning?" Emily stared at the keys. "You trust me with these?" "My dear, anyone who alphabetized 300 books during the village fair without being asked has already passed the test." Her fingers closed carefully around the metal. For the rest of the morning she worked with a focus Daniel hadn't seen before. She arranged displays, repaired torn dust jackets, and helped customers find books they had forgotten they wanted. One little boy wandered in clutching a library card. "I'm looking for a story about a brave dog," he announced. Emily crouched to his height. "Brave because he fights monsters, or brave because he helps people?" The boy thought carefully. "Helps people. Then I know exactly the book." Arthur watched from behind the counter, smiling quietly. When Daniel arrived later to walk her home, he found Emily carrying a small stack of books and looking 10 years younger than she had the day they met. "Good first day?" he asked. She nodded. "I remembered something." "What?" "I still know who I am." Over the following weeks, Ashbrook began to know Emily not as a stranger staying in Daniel's spare room, but as the woman who could recommend a novel for any mood. Mrs. Foster stopped by the shop twice a week. The school secretary ordered books through Emily because she always included handwritten notes suggesting additional titles. Teenagers who normally avoided reading somehow ended up leaving with adventure stories tucked under their arms. One afternoon Daniel entered the shop carrying a repaired oak chair for Arthur. He paused near the doorway. Emily was speaking with an elderly customer who seemed embarrassed about searching for large print books. "There is nothing wrong with needing bigger words," Emily said kindly. "Stories should never become smaller because our eyes change." The woman's shoulders relaxed instantly. After she left, Daniel approached the counter. "You're very good at this." Emily looked down, suddenly shy. "I forgot how much I missed helping people find the right book. Sometimes the right book arrives when the right person hands it to us." She tilted her head. Is that one of your grandmother's sayings? No. That one's mine. That evening they sat in the garden eating tomato sandwiches while the sun drifted lower behind the hedges. Emily had grown stronger since arriving. The constant worry that once shadowed her face had begun to lift, replaced by a steadier expression. Yet Daniel noticed moments when she still fell silent unexpectedly, as though listening to a conversation only she could hear. Tonight was one of those moments. You don't have to tell me anything, he said quietly. But you seem far away. Emily set down her tea. I was thinking about the flat. Daniel waited. When I left, I thought I was losing everything. The job had ended months earlier. My savings disappeared paying bills. Friends had moved away. Every day I told myself tomorrow would be better, and every tomorrow looked exactly the same. She stared at the garden. I became so embarrassed that I stopped answering messages. Then I stopped sending them. Eventually it felt easier to disappear than explain why I was struggling. Daniel understood more than she realized. Loneliness often arrived long before people noticed it. What changed? He asked gently. Emily looked at him. You stopped walking. He frowned slightly. What do you mean? In the courtyard. Most people heard me and kept moving. You stopped. Daniel had no clever reply. Sometimes the smallest choice carried the greatest weight. A few days later, Emily returned from the bookshop carrying a brown envelope. I've been offered something, she said. Daniel looked up from repairing a cabinet hinge. That sounds promising. Arthur wants me to work 3 mornings every week permanently. Emily, that's wonderful. He says the shop feels brighter when I'm there. Daniel grinned. He's right. She sat across from him, turning the envelope over in her hands. I should start looking for a place of my own. The words were expected. Daniel had known this moment would come. Still, something inside him tightened unexpectedly. You should do whatever helps you build the life you want. Emily nodded slowly. But? He smiled faintly. But the garden will miss its chief tomato inspector. She laughed, though her eyes remained thoughtful. I don't want to become a burden. You never were. It's been nearly a month. And you've brought more life into this house than I managed in 3 years. Emily looked away, clearly moved. Daniel changed the subject before the moment became too heavy. Arthur mentioned a book delivery arriving tomorrow. Think you can survive 50 boxes of mystery novels? Only if you help carry them. Deal. The next morning they walked to the shop together. Halfway down Willow Street, Daniel noticed several people greeting Emily by name. Morning, Emily. Save me a good detective story. Tell Arthur his poetry display worked. I bought 2 books. Emily answered each greeting with growing ease. When they reached the shop, Arthur was waiting outside beside a mountain of cardboard boxes. You two are just in time, he declared. Either we unpack these, or they become permanent street furniture. For hours they sorted books, stacked shelves, and argued cheerfully about whether detective novels belonged beside thrillers or historical fiction. At lunchtime Arthur disappeared into the bakery and returned with warm cheese rolls. You know, he said casually, I've been thinking. Emily looked up. Dangerous habit. Quite. The room above the shop has been empty since my nephew moved to Bristol. It isn't large, but it has a bed, a kettle, and a window overlooking the square. Emily's hands froze. Arthur continued gently, if you ever decide you want your own place nearby, I'd rather rent it to someone who loves books than leave it collecting dust. The offer hung quietly between them. Emily swallowed. That's incredibly generous. No rush, Arthur said. Just something to consider. Daniel kept unpacking books, careful not to let his expression reveal too much. He wanted her to stay. But more than that, he wanted her to feel free. That evening Emily stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes while Daniel dried them. "You're thinking about the room above the shop," he said. "Is it obvious?" "A little." She placed a plate carefully on the counter. "Part of me wants it. Part of me is terrified. Because it means starting again? Because it means believing I can." Daniel leaned against the counter. "When I lost my sister, I spent months keeping her room exactly the same. I thought moving anything would mean admitting life had changed." Emily listened quietly. "One day my nephew asked why the room was still waiting for someone who wasn't coming home. He wasn't being cruel. He just wanted to know." "What did you do?" "I opened the curtains." Emily looked toward the window where evening light filled the kitchen. "That doesn't sound like much." It was enough to begin. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Emily said softly, "You know, when I whispered that I had nowhere left to go, I didn't actually expect an answer." Daniel met her eyes. "I'm glad you stayed long enough to hear one." The following week arrived with a quiet sense of anticipation that neither Daniel nor Emily spoke aloud. Life had settled into a comforting rhythm, yet both of them knew that change was approaching, not the kind that takes something away, but the kind that asks people to take a brave step forward. Emily visited the room above Arthur's bookshop one Wednesday afternoon. It was small, just as Arthur had described. A single bedroom overlooked the village square, where children rode bicycles after school and neighbors stopped to chat beside the flower beds. There was a narrow kitchen with pale wooden cupboards, a little sitting room with a bookshelf built into one wall, and a window that welcomed the morning sun. "It isn't perfect," Arthur said as he handed her a cup of tea. Emily smiled. "I've learned that perfect isn't what makes a place feel like home." Arthur nodded thoughtfully. "No. People do." She walked slowly from room to room. For the first time in many months, she wasn't looking for somewhere to hide. She was imagining somewhere to live. That evening she returned to Daniel's cottage carrying the spare key Arthur had lent her. Daniel was watering the tomatoes when she opened the garden gate. "How was it?" he asked. Emily sat on the old wooden bench beneath the apple tree. "It's lovely. I'm happy for you." She looked at him carefully. "You sound happier than I expected." Daniel chuckled. "I'll admit something." "What?" "I was hoping you'd stay forever." Emily's eyes softened. "But I never wanted you to stay because you had nowhere else to go." She listened quietly. "I wanted you to stay only if it helped you become the person you were always meant to be." Emily looked down at her hands. "I don't know how to thank you." Daniel shook his head. "You already have." "I haven't done anything." "You reminded this house what laughter sounds like." A comfortable silence settled between them. The apple tree rustled gently in the afternoon breeze. Sometimes gratitude needed no larger conversation than that. A few days later the village organized its annual Community Kindness Fair, an event that celebrated volunteers, local charities, and neighbors who quietly helped one another throughout the year. Arthur insisted the bookshop host a storytelling corner. Mrs. Foster baked enough pies to feed half the county. Daniel volunteered to restore old wooden toys that families donated. Emily spent the morning arranging books for children and writing little handwritten recommendation cards that simply read. This story made someone smile. Perhaps it will make you smile too. People loved them. Several visitors returned later just to thank her. One elderly gentleman held up a novel she had recommended. "I haven't finished a book in years," he admitted. "But last night I couldn't put this one down." Emily smiled. "I'm very glad." "No," he replied. "I'm very grateful." Daniel watched the conversation from across the square. He noticed something remarkable. When he had first met Emily, she had spoken barely above a whisper. Now she spoke with quiet confidence, not because life had become easy, but because she had rediscovered her place within it. As the afternoon drew to a close, the mayor stepped onto the small stage in the village square. "We have one final recognition today." The crowd grew quiet. "Each year we honor someone whose kindness reminds us what community truly means." Daniel continued sanding a toy train, paying little attention. The mayor smiled. "This year's Community Heart Award goes to Daniel Mercer." Daniel looked up in surprise. "I'm afraid you've made a mistake." The crowd laughed warmly. The mayor shook his head. "No mistake." Mrs. Foster clapped enthusiastically. Arthur folded his arms with a satisfied grin. Emily smiled through shining eyes. The mayor continued. "We often celebrate grand achievements, but sometimes the greatest kindness is simply opening a door when someone has nowhere else to go." Daniel's expression became thoughtful. "I only did what anyone should do." Arthur called from the crowd. "Perhaps." Mrs. Foster added. "But you were the one who actually did it." Applause filled the square. Daniel accepted the small wooden plaque with obvious embarrassment. "I don't deserve this alone," he said. Every person here welcomed Emily without asking her to prove she belonged. Every smile, every conversation, every opportunity mattered. He looked around the crowd. Kindness isn't one person's achievement. It's something we build together. The applause grew even louder. Emily quietly wiped away a tear. Not because Daniel had mentioned her, but because she finally understood something she had been unable to believe for so long. She had never needed to earn kindness. She only needed to accept it. The following Saturday became moving day. Daniel borrowed Arthur's old delivery van. Between the two of them, Emily's belongings filled surprisingly few boxes. "That's everything?" Daniel asked. Emily laughed. "It used to make me sad. And now? It reminds me I can choose carefully what I carry into the future." Mrs. Foster appeared carrying a basket. "I brought sandwiches." Arthur arrived moments later with a potted lavender plant. Every home deserves something that keeps growing. Other neighbors stopped by throughout the morning. Someone donated curtains. Another neighbor brought spare kitchen dishes. A retired carpenter delivered a little coffee table he had restored himself. No one treated Emily like a charity case. They treated her like a neighbor. By sunset the little flat above the bookshop looked warm, welcoming, and unmistakably hers. Emily stood in the middle of the sitting room, turning slowly. "It's home." Daniel smiled. "Yes. It really is." Life continued to move forward. Emily's position at the bookshop gradually became full-time. She organized reading afternoons for local children. She started a monthly book club that attracted people of every age. She introduced a shelf labeled Stories That Heal, filled with novels about hope, friendship, forgiveness, courage, and second chances. The shelf became one of the most popular in the shop. Meanwhile, Daniel continued repairing furniture, though business unexpectedly improved after several customers from the village fair recommended his work. Whenever he delivered a finished cabinet or restored rocking chair, people often added, "Emily from the bookshop said you're the person to call." He always smiled. It seemed they were still helping one another, simply in different ways. Months passed. One crisp autumn afternoon Daniel visited the shop carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Emily looked up from arranging new arrivals. "You've brought another chair for Arthur?" "No." He placed the parcel on the counter. "This one's for you." Emily carefully untied the string. Inside lay a beautifully restored wooden bookmark. Carved into its smooth surface were simple words. "Every new chapter begins with hope." She ran her fingers across the polished wood. "You made this?" Daniel nodded. "From the apple tree branch we trimmed last spring." Emily smiled through tears. I'll use it every day. I hoped you would. She looked around the bookshop. Children browsed colorful shelves. Arthur argued cheerfully with a customer about classic novels. Sunlight streamed through the front windows. Life felt wonderfully ordinary. And somehow, that ordinary life felt extraordinary. That evening Emily walked with Daniel back toward his cottage, just as they had done countless times before. The vegetable garden was still overflowing with tomatoes. The bench beneath the apple tree remained exactly where it had always been. Only the people sitting there had changed. "I've been thinking," Emily said. "Dangerous habit," Daniel replied with a grin. She laughed. "I remember every word from the day we met." "So do I." I whispered that I had nowhere left to go. Daniel nodded. "And you answered." She paused before smiling warmly. "Then stay with me." Daniel looked toward the quiet garden. "I meant more than the spare room." Emily understood. He had offered safety, respect, time, hope, the chance to begin again. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded envelope. "I have something for you." He opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten note. It read, "Dear Daniel. You once told me that kindness isn't asking for someone's story. It's giving them enough safety to tell it when they're ready. You gave me that safety. You never tried to rescue me. You simply reminded me that I still mattered. Because of your kindness, I found work I love. I found neighbors who became friends. I found a home. Most importantly, I found myself again. Whenever someone walks into the bookshop looking a little lost, I remember the day you stopped walking long enough to notice me. Now I try to do the same for others. Thank you for showing me that hope often begins with one ordinary conversation. With endless gratitude. Emily. *. Daniel folded the letter slowly. "I'll keep this forever. I hoped you would." The evening grew quiet. The first stars appeared above Ashbrook. Neither of them hurried to leave. There was no need. Some friendships are built over years. Others begin with a single act of compassion and become part of the foundation on which countless future kindnesses are built. Long after that first meeting in the library courtyard, people in Ashbrook would tell newcomers about the little bookshop where everyone was greeted with a smile, where handwritten recommendations appeared inside well-loved novels, and where no one was ever made to feel invisible. Very few people knew how it had all started. It had begun with a tired voice whispering, "I have nowhere left to go." And with someone choosing not to walk past. Because the greatest gift we can offer another person is not wealth, perfection, or all the answers. It is the quiet assurance that they do not have to face tomorrow alone. One open door can become a new beginning. One kind sentence can restore a fading hope. And one compassionate heart can change a life in ways that echo far beyond a single day. Sometimes home is not the place where your story began. Sometimes home is the place where someone looked at you with kindness, believed you still had a future, and gently said, "You belong here." And from that moment forward, hope wrote every new chapter.